the day is oocyte. You say both O's. So can someone tell me in English what an oocyte is? It's an egg cell. It's an egg. So everywhere on this picture we see oocyte or oo something, they just mean egg. So O. Right? So here I have an oogony, meaning immature egg, primary oocyte, another oocyte, here's some more oocytes, lots and oocytes. Then you have to remember biology 112 and know what the difference between primary and secondary means. Can someone tell me what a primary oocyte means? It means egg something. What about the egg?
First egg.
First egg, yes indeed. So primary oocyte. The first meaning before meiosis. All right, let's see if you remember what meiosis was in biology 112. No one's now. Yes.
Is it before like the DNA splits into two?
Almost.
But it's like 4 times.
I like that better.
Yeah.
So meiosis, remember, was sexual division. Remember they're making haploids. Does that ring a bell? PMAT times 2? Lie to me. Anyway. All right. So if you're a primary oocyte, it means you're a diploid cell. You have not undergone meiosis. You have all your chromosomes. That doesn't ring a bell. Retake 112. So then, if you're a secondary, that's an ugly pen. Let's try that again. If you're a secondary oocyte, what does that mean, you think? So secondary oocyte is after meiosis, which means you are haploid. Right? So the difference between 2N and 1N, basically. So they're still eggs. Nothing has changed except they're diploid or haploid, their chromosome count. So on this picture, we have a primary oocyte here because I haven't done meiosis yet. I've done mitosis, but that's not the same. So this is 2N. There's a 2N in there. Right? Remember that? So here's 2N. Here's diploid. Here's diploid. Uh-oh, those are N's. That's secondary. That's after meiosis. So we have to figure out when this occurs. So when do you have primaries and when do you have secondaries? If you look on the thing here, when are all your primaries at? Look up here. When is it? Before birth. So you have primary oocytes are generally before birth. I just need to get rid of that pen. Before birth. So women have their eggs before you're born. Your eggs are actually older than you are, if you think about it for a minute. All right. So go to the pen. Ah. All right, so when do you get your secondary oocytes? When do you do meiosis? What time after birth? Yeah, I get that. When after birth?
Puberty.
Puberty! So puberty is when you begin reproducing, and that's when you're going to do meiosis. And when do you stop doing this meiosis thing?
Menopause.
Menopause. So from puberty to menopause, you're making secondary oocytes. You're cranking out meiotic events. Before birth, though, they're all primaries. Right? So remember males, right? We just make sperm basically until we drop dead. Women, you start before birth, you stop, and then you start again at puberty, and you stop again. Right? So this red cell is some kind of oocyte, some kind of egg, either before birth, primary, or after birth, secondary. Right? Now, if you look at this red thing here, that red thing there is that red thing right there. All right? So I'm zooming in. So this egg is that pink thing right there. So now we have these other words. What is this yellow stuff around the egg? Look at the F word up there.
Follicle.
Follicle. So the F word of the day, it is a bad pen. Isn't better? Follicle. Not much better. That's actually almost worse. All right, so the word follicle. What is it? So tell me where it is. Around the egg. So the follicle is our cells around an egg. Or to be fancy, cells around an oocyte. So the oocyte is the egg. The follicle is not the egg. The follicle is what's around the egg. So this is a really bizarre analogy, but it works on the farm. So if you walk up to a tree and see a bird's nest, the nest is where the eggs live, right? Okay, so the follicle is the nest. The oocyte is the egg. They're not the same thing. They're maybe in the same place, but they're not the same thing. So on this picture, the yellow is the follicle, the red is the egg. It is primary, so that tells you it's when? Before birth. Okay, blah, 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 blah. So now after puberty, so once I start making eggs, what do you notice here about the size of the oocyte once I hit puberty? Is it getting bigger?
No, the oocyte.
Say yes, yes. What's happening to the follicle? It's growing as well. So once you start puberty, your eggs start to grow, and your follicles grow with them. Does that make sense? Okay, now take a look at this picture here. What is that showing me? I'm releasing an egg. What do you think we call that when you release an egg?
Ovulation.
Ovulation. Oh, for sure, I have one more bright. I don't. Ah! There it is. Ah, look at this orange. I'm like, oh, it's glossy. Ovulation. Ovulation is the other word we have to know. So ovulation means to release what? What are you releasing? The oocyte from the follicle. So the important idea is that the egg is what gets released, not the follicle. When chicks hatch, the eggs hatch, not the nest. So when you ovulate, you're releasing an oocyte from the follicle. All right? Now, so what I've done here is I've ovulated my secondary oocyte. My egg is leaving the nest. Makes sense? So when you hit puberty, you're going to take your baby eggs and their baby nests, to use some weird language, and you're going to grow them, and then you're going to release an egg out of the nest. Make sense? All right, that made sense. I'm going to do it this way. So this is showing your ovary right here, and those pictures are showing the same steps I just showed you. Let's see if we can find them. So over here, right there, boom. Those are oocytes before birth, right? Because they say primary. So here is the oocyte. This dark circle is the egg cell, oocyte. The pink must be the follicle, and that's what it is. So as you're going along, you're growing eggs in growing nests. So here's a nice big nest with a nice big egg. And then right here, what is that?
Ovulation.
Ovulation, because here's the egg and here's the follicle. Here's the nest that used to be in. This is not the scale. Right? Now, let's look at this thing here. What is that?
Empty nest.
It's an empty nest. You can go in the forest and see empty nests all over the place. Right? So your ovary has empty follicles where the egg used to be. That's so important it gets a name. What's the name of that thing?
Corpus luteum.
That's a name you got to know. So let's put that on the board over here. Corpus luteum. Or corpus luteum. You'll hear both of them. What is that? That's the empty follicle. That's the, I'm sorry, not the, yeah, that's the empty follicle, yeah. So one second. Empty follicle. So when did that appear? Why is it empty? It's after ovulation. So after you ovulate, the nest stays behind and is empty. We call that the corpus luteum. So you have a follicle before you ovulate, and you have a corpus luteum after, because it's empty or full. Make sense? All right, so look at this thing over here. What is that? It says corpus albicans, I know that, but what is that?
Recycle the follicle.
Close. So it's the same follicle. What did the follicle do? It's getting smaller, it's degenerating, it's rotting, it's atrophying. There's lots of words you can use. So if we put this all together, I'm going to start over here and kind of go counterclockwise. So here are my baby eggs I had before birth, if I were a female. I'm going to grow some. So here's my primary follicles getting bigger and bigger for the eggs inside. At some point, I'm going to ovulate. I'm going to release the egg into your fallopian tube. The leftovers become a corpus luteum. Eventually, that dies. The next month, I do it again. So I'm going to grow an egg, release one, leftovers die. Release one, leftover die.
What happens to the leftover?
They stay in your ovary, make a scar, and I can count them on the slide, see how many eggs you made. growth distributed. Right? That's the base, yes?
So one primary turns into a secondary every month?
Actually, yes, we actually start with more than one primary. So eventually one primary becomes a secondary, but there could be multiple primaries, but you're going to end up with one secondary. At the end of the day. So I want you to notice, is besides this, is where ovulation is in this pathway. So if you start here and go to there, where's ovulation at? In the middle. So that's another important concept. You ovulate in the middle of the cycle. So when we do the next part, which we're going to do now, you're going to have two pieces of paper in your notes. You're going to have a before ovulation. You're going to have an after ovulation, because ovulation is what's in the middle of your menstrual cycle. So clear your mind, body, and soul. You need two sides of your paper, or actually 2.5. You need a blank side, because we're going to redo this one more time linearly, like this. All right? So we're going to do the menstrual cycle linearly. So this board here will be before ovulation. And can you guess what this board over here is going to be? After ovulation. Very good. So make your sheets of paper now. There'll be approximately 7 steps in each, give or take. So over here, before ovulation. All right, so this is everything that's going to be before ovulate. Over here will be everything after ovulation. And ovulation will be right here, okay? So let's do some wording. If you look here, we have shortcuts. What's the word for before ovulation?
Follicular
The
phase.
follicular phase. So on a test, you could say follicular phase. And why is it the follicular phase? Because you have follicles before you ovulate. You have eggs and nests. So follicular phase is a short way before ovulation. Can anyone tell me what you see? Because ovulation is this line. So what do we call it after you ovulate?
Luteal.
Luteal phase. Or luteal phase. Can you guess why we call it luteal phase? That's where the corpus luteum is, right? The corpus luteum is after ovulation. So that's the phase for corpus luteum. That's the phase for follicles. Everyone with me? All right, so now we're going to go back through it again. So on the left of the screen, zoo, that thing there. What is that? Today, it's an oocyte. Good word. Inside a follicle. You had before birth. And like I taught you, the eggs and follicles are growing in the follicular phase. I'm growing eggs. What tells them to grow?
Growth hormone.
Let's find out. Oh, look, there are 3 letters up there. FSH. What did they stand for from last term?
Follicle stimulating.
Follicles. Okay, so let's start making a litany here. We have follicle stimulation. So from last week, where does follicle stimulation hormone come from?
Anterior pituitary.
And what tells your anterior pituitary to make that? The hypothalamus. We're going to start with a hypothalamus. You always start with your hypothalamus. And what hormone must it release to cause FSH to come out? GnRH. So your hypothalamus is going to crank out GnRH from last week, gonadotropic releasing hormone. So just like a male, we're going to start with the same step. My brain is going to tell my anterior pituitary to increase FSH, and it also increases LH, which I'll show you in a second. So my hypothalamus tells my pituitary to crank out the tropic hormones. All right. So what's the target of FSH and LH? If you're a female. The ovaries. So step number 3. Those are going to tell my ovaries to do what? What are my ovaries doing? Making an egg. Very good. So the ovaries grow eggs. You can say oocytes and follicles. So my hypothalamus tells my pituitary to tell my ovaries to grow the eggs. And that's all happening in the follicular phase. Hence, why I'm getting follicles and eggs beforehand. Right? To show you I'm not making this up much, here's a graph there, showing LH and FSH as the pituitary hormones. They're being induced by my hypothalamus. to order my ovary to crank out these. Okay? So here's the question. Look at this graph. What's that? Those are hormones. From where?
Ovaries.
Ovaries. Okay, so look at the red line. The red line is estrogen. Okay? Look at estrogen and tell me what it's doing in the follicular phase. It's increasing. So, when your brain orders your pituitary to order your ovaries to grow things, the ovaries are going to make fat, and specifically the follicle cells. Your follicles are going to produce estrogen. So the ovaries make eggs and follicles. The follicles in turn make estrogen. So estrogen goes up in the follicular phase. So far you had a brain talk to a pituitary, talk to an ovary, right? But we're not done yet. So this goes up, these get big, this goes up. Why are you making estrogen? I mean, you already got the eggs, why do you need that?
Ovulation.
Almost.
Follicle. Secondary.
Tell me, placental mammals, what else do you need for babies besides eggs?
Nutrients.
Food.
Where?
Uterine lining.
Your uterus, right? Last week you learned uterus is where babies are. We haven't done anything with uterus. That's what that's for. So step number 5. We got to find a uterus if we want to have babies. So down here, boom. That is your uterine lining. That bottom graph there. So this is called the endometrium. And so the estrogen affects your endometrium. What is your uterus doing in that slide?
Growing.
It's growing. So the estrogen causes a growth of the endometrium. If you don't like that word, that's your uterine lining. So the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to tell the ovaries to tell the uterus what to do. Right? 4 organs in a row. So I make the eggs that make the follicle. The follicle makes the estrogen makes your uterus. Why do you want to grow?
So the eggs fit.
Egg can implant. When you're pregnant, baby's going to live right here. So you need to have a thick uterus before you release the egg. So you're building a home for baby, basically, in step 5. Right? That's all before ovulation. Make sense? Okay, so now, let's see what the next step is. So go back to this graph. What's the estrogen doing as you go through the follicular phase?
Increasing.
It's increasing. Notice it makes a really big spike right here. What does that tell your body to do? There's a lot of estrogen. Tells you to ovulate. That's where we're going to induce ovulation. So over here, we're going to put a little column for ovulation. We'll put it right over here. So yes, you actually need another column. So,
Do we have more steps for the before ovulation?
no more steps before ovulation. Here's ovulation, the step between that one and this one. Estrogen peaks. So your estrogen levels have skyrocketed because you're growing big follicles. And so they go way, way up. Well, so what? How does that make you ovulate? How does having high estrogen make that happen? Because remember, estrogen affects your uterus, not your ovaries. Good job, because I'm going to show you this graph. Look at the red and the blue. What do you see?
LH peaks.
LH and FSH. So, when your estrogen goes up and peaks, that causes, number 2, an increase in LH and FSH. Those also peak. So remind me again what LH and FSH tell you to do?
Make follicles
Grow
stimulate.
eggs, right? Which then tell you to make estrogen, which tells you to peak these. So when these hormones are peaking, that tells your body to ovulate, tells you to release the egg. Okay? So, can anyone guess what kind of feedback this would be if this makes more of that, which makes more of that, which makes more of that?
Positive.
Positive feedback. One of the few times in your life you can say positive feedback and not have me screech and scream. ovulation requires positive feedback to make the graph spike. That way you release the egg. Or you ovulate. So far, I've told my ovaries to make eggs, to make estrogen, to grow a uterus, and that tells them to do more of it to release the egg eventually. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an animation of this process up to where we are now. So the follicular phase, basically, is right here.
At sexual maturity, each of a woman's ovaries contains about 200,000 immature eggs called primary oocytes. A primary oocyte is diploid and is arrested in prophase 1 of meiosis. A layer of follicle cells surrounds each primary oocyte. Together, an oocyte and its follicle cells make up a follicle. An ovarian cycle lasts about 28 days, beginning at the first day of menstruation or menses.
Okay, so before you freak out, there are different ways to do the days. So in the dark ages, when I learned this, I learned menstruation's at the end of the cycle. Right? So that's kind of how I'm going to present it. So you do all this stuff, and then you menstruate at the end and restart. Saladin and this website put menstruation at the very beginning of the cycle. So you menstruate and then you start. It doesn't matter where you put it because you're going to end up back where you started anyway. So I don't care on a test if you say menstruation is at the beginning, or at the end, at the middle. I don't care as long as you get the sequence of events correct. Right? So I'm going to put it back over here because that's where I learned it. But you can put it at the beginning or the end. So it doesn't change what we're learning, it just changes how you write it on paper. Make sense? To me, it makes sense because you have to ovulate before you menstruate. So I always put it at the end. But so don't freak out that menstruation is the beginning or the end. It's always somewhere. Right?
During the first 7 days of the cycle, 6 to 12 primary oocytes begin to mature. As the follicles develop, the follicle cells communicate with oocytes and pass them nutrients through pores called gap junctions.
Which no one has to know that.
Each oocyte grows larger and the surrounding follicle cells divide, proliferating to produce thousands of follicle cells in a single follicle.
That's where you're growing the egg. So before you ovulate, the eggs can get bigger, the nest gets bigger. That's what you're seeing here. Okay?
By day 7, all but one of the developing follicles begins to degenerate. The remaining follicle continues to develop, and its follicle cells continue to pump it with nourishment, and also supply it with proteins and informational molecules needed for early stages of development. The maturing primary oocyte completes meiosis 1 and divides into 2 haploid cells. Each of these cells receives half the chromosomes. However, one cell, called a polar body, receives very little cytoplasm. The other, now a secondary oocyte, enters meiosis 2 and arrests there until fertilization. At day 14, ovulation occurs, and the secondary oocyte erupts.
Okay, so it's not day 14, it's halfway through the cycle, right? So they're assuming it's 28 days and half of 28 is 14. That's where this logic comes from. Now I'm ovulating, so I'm going to release the egg
from the ovary. The oviduct contains microscopic cilia that beat and draw in the released oocytes. This immature egg enters an oviduct, where it may become fertilized by a sperm cell and complete meiosis.
So that was before my ovulation and follicular phase. That's just the egg getting bigger and being released. Make sense? Okay, so now let's review that same thing again, this time with the hormones. Here's the graph.
The ovarian cycle is controlled by the interplay of hormones from the pituitary gland and from the ovary itself. A few days before the beginning of the cycle, the anterior pituitary begins to increase its secretion of 2 hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. FSH and LH stimulate ovarian follicles to grow. As the follicles grow, they begin to secrete estrogen. During this phase of the cycle, the increasing levels of estrogen feed back on the pituitary to inhibit the release of additional FSH and LH. During the next week, the levels of FSH and LH drop. Beginning around day 12, The increasing levels of estrogen suddenly have the opposite effect on the pituitary gland. Instead of exerting a negative feedback on the pituitary, these hormones now exert a positive feedback, stimulating the pituitary to release FSH and large amounts of LH. LH reaches a peak at day 14 of the ovarian cycle. This LH surge triggers the mature follicle to rupture and release the egg, the process of ovulation. LH then triggers the remaining follicle cells to differentiate into the corpus luteum.
We'll do next. So I'm making LH and FSH, growing my egg, which raises my estrogen, which then eventually causes this to spike, which causes that to spike, and then you ovulate when all three are up. So far, so good? Yes?
So it first starts as a negative feedback
Yeah.
and switches?
Right. So it's really kind of weird. You have like a 4-day window of positive feedback buried amongst the negative feedback month.
What causes that
Magic?
switch?
Actually, what's weird is the pituitary changes the interpretation. So your pituitary goes from saying, I don't want more, all of a sudden, I want a lot more. So it's actually the hypothalamus pituitary interpret the same information for the opposite reason. We think it's a receptor somewhere, which is a lame answer, but that's the idea.
Is it random which oocyte gets chosen to?
More or less, yeah. So when the oocytes are starting, the hypothesis is that one is going to be faster than the other, so the fastest one wins that month.
Mm-hmm.
So that one's released, the slow ones decay, then next month the next faster one goes. But it's random, so in theory you never know which egg will be winning. That guarantees meiotic randomization. So every kid could be different, yes?
So women that have really irregular periods,
Yes.
do they ovulate less? Is that something?
It's possible, I mean, it depends on why they're irregular. But yeah, you can have where you don't ovulate a month or you ovulate.
So it could vary. You could
Yes.
only ovulate when you have your period versus you could ovulate regularly just through your
Right.
period.
You can have a period that's the cycle's so short you actually don't have time to ovulate. Like PCOS will do that. You'll end up with these short cycles that you don't ovulate. And long cycles where you ovulate and then wait longer. That's good.
So the FSH makes you have more follicular cells, and then
Yes.
more cells means more like secretion of estrogen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so as the follicle gets bigger, estrogen climbs as well. Yes.
Can you do one secondary oocyte at a time, or?
You can actually double ovulate. You can have two, one on each side, so you can have fraternal twins would be you ovulate 2 eggs at one time, but they'd be separate, one from each side. Or if you have triplets, fraternal, you can have 3. But normally it's only one secondary oocyte that's ovulated per month. Okay. So now let's put that together with the uterus. Because you have the ovaries in the brain and the estrogen and all that, and the uterus part. Right?
The ovarian and uterine cycles are tightly coordinated. Hormones secreted by the ovary at different phases of the ovarian cycle trigger changes in the uterine lining.
Okay, so if you're reading Saladin, he breaks up you have ovarian cycle, and then a page later you have uterine cycle. I put them together as one big menstrual cycle thing. So be aware that I'm combining the ovary and the uterus as one line of thought, but people do split them. So I don't care if you keep them separate in your mind or together, but they're all related.
For example, at the beginning of the cycles, the levels of estrogen and progesterone are too low to maintain the uterine lining, and menses begins. About a week into the ovarian cycle, the developing follicle increases its secretion of estrogen, and estrogen levels in the body begin to rise. This hormone triggers the cells of the uterine lining to proliferate, and the lining becomes thicker. Just before ovulation, the level of estrogen in the body has reached its peak. Afterward, the follicle cells remaining in the ovary develop into the corpus luteum.
So right now what we've done is we've grown your uterus, made it thicker because of the estrogen before ovulation. Now we've ovulated. Now for the next part, we're going to go to that side of the board and do all the post-ovulatory stuff. So we're now going to be over here the rest of the while. All right? So let's go over to the right-hand board and do the post-ovulatory luteal phase. Same kind of stuff.
So is it just the epithelium is thickening? Or is it different?
The epithelium and the connective tissues underneath. So you increase blood flow, you increase glandulars, basically the whole lining thickens. So it's basically like growing more skin, basically. So where are we? Okay, over here, luteal phase. So in the luteal phase, after ovulation, the LH, which you made over there, and spiked over here, continues to be made. So you keep making LH. And that's going to cause corpus luteum to form. Remind me again what a corpus luteum was? The old follicle. So LH, luteinizing hormone, turns your old follicle into a corpus luteum. It causes it to change. So now I have corpus lutea where I used to have a follicle. So the LH, the red line, is making it turn into a corpus luteum. Great. What does a corpus luteum do? So let's find out. Corpus luteum makes two hormones. Can anyone guess what hormones are made by your corpus luteum? Let's look down here. I see a red and a green line. Let's find out. What are those hormones? Estrogen and progesterone. And they're both being made by the corpus luteum. So LH makes the corpus luteum form. The corpus luteum then makes estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen we had over there, but now we've added progesterone. So what do you think the job of this estrogen is for after ovulation? I think it's the same as over here. I want to grow my endometrium. So this estrogen, for step number 3 basically, is to maintain the growth of the endometrium. Can someone tell me why you want to keep your endometrium now that you've ovulated?
In case you get pregnant.
In case you get pregnant, baby's living there, right? So we're going to grow our uterus and then keep it around. So we're going to have it and then keep it after ovulation. The progesterone, that one's new. So progesterone is going to do a slightly different job. So I'm going to go down here. So the green spike, this kind of hump, that's progesterone. If I scroll straight down to your uterus, that. Does anyone see a relationship between the green and what you see down here?
Where's the blue stuff?
The who, what?
Increased blood flow.
Increased blood flow. Those are vessels. Very good. So progesterone is to increase blood flow in the endometrium. So I want more blood in your endometrium. Hazard me a guess why that is.
For babies.
For babies, right? Placental mammals, you eat mom. So that's what you're going to do. So I need a thick home and more blood to chew on. So progesterone increases vascularization by making the blood vessels get bigger. That's what these are. Right? What else does it do besides the increased blood flow? Glad you asked. Progesterone also closes the cervix. Oh, wow. Let's talk about that cervix again. From last week, what's the cervix do?
Gatekeeper.
Gatekeeper. Why do you want it closed? Keep baby in and keep crud out, right? So if it closed here because of progesterone, it had to be open somewhere. Anyone guess when it was open? Bingo! So one other thing we can add here is the cervix open, which you learned last week, actually. So when you ovulate, your cervix has to open to let the sperm in, and then you immediately close the door to keep the little buggers out. Right? Yes?
Is that why the levels of progesterone are lower during ovulation so that your cervix stays?
Yeah. So basically, estrogen causes an increase in that. Basically, progesterone doesn't kick in until afterwards. Right? All right, let's do another one. Progesterone has another job. Actually, use this word. Calms the uterine muscles. Okay, what does that mean, calming the muscles? What does that mean?
Relax.
Relax. So why do you want your uterus to relax? Or the other way, why don't you want it to contract?
Because you need to keep the baby in there.
That's right, because if you contract, that's called labor and cramping, and that's going to flush everything out. So you don't want the uterus to get excited, you want it to calm down. Let's use that phrase. So therefore, no contractions. because you want baby to live there. So after I ovulate, I'm going to make corpus luteum that's going to basically turn on these hormones and keep you thick, keep you bloody, keep it closed, keep it quiet, is how we remember it. That's what you're going to do after ovulation. All right? But you're not done yet. So that just got me to here. All right? But what did you tell me the corpus luteum does eventually?
Sheds its lining.
Let's find out. What did it do there? It dies, it shrinks, it regresses. So we're going to assume that you're not pregnant. We're going to do this step. So step number kind of 4-ish. So let's do if not pregnant. Let's assume that next week you'll be pregnant. Today you're not pregnant. Step number 4. Corpus luteum dies, decays, regresses, atrophies. Pick a word you like. Okay? So your corpus luteum eventually decays. Someone tell me what's going to happen to my estrogen and progesterone when the corpus luteum dies. They're going to go down. So I'm going to lose estrogen and lose progesterone. Because the thing that made it died, they get left behind. So my corpus luteum has now become an albicans, or degrading. That's going to lower the red and the green. And then what are you going to do with all that nice, thick, bloody uterus now? You're going to flush that out. That's menstruation. You remove everything you just built and toss it. So when those go down, that's called menstruation. So when you menstruate, you get rid of everything you did here in step 3. And so then, what are you going to do now, next month? Start all over again. So the brain says, oh, let's try this again. I want an egg. Pituitary, give me an egg. Okay, ovaries, give me an egg. Okay, give me a uterus. Ovulate, woo! Hey, no baby. Flush, repeat. Boom. And that's basically each month you're bouncing between that side and this side. Make sense? Kind of cool, isn't it? I think it's fascinating. All right. As a male, I just think it's fascinating. Okay. So let's do an animation of this idea. Let's go back to here, here, here.
I thought you were like trying to.
Okay, so we'll go back through the steps we were at. So we left off at ovulation, halfway through.
The follicle cells that are left behind develop into a small mass of endocrine tissue called the corpus luteum.
Indeed.
The corpus luteum remains in the ovary for 2 weeks, secreting the hormones estrogen and progesterone. At the end of the ovarian cycle, if the woman is not pregnant, the corpus luteum disintegrates. Each month, the ovarian cycle is tightly coordinated with the uterine cycle. In the uterine cycle, the lining of the uterus builds up and then sloughs off. The cycle begins with the sloughing of the uterine lining. This is the first day of menses, also called menstruation.
Or it could be the last.
After menstruation, the uterine lining starts to grow again and to prepare for implantation of an embryo. During this phase of the uterine cycle, up until ovulation, the uterine lining proliferates. Capillary beds supply this tissue with nutrients. Just before menstruation occurs again, the capillary beds degenerate and no longer deliver the surrounding tissue with nutrients. During menstruation, this tissue dies and sloughs off through the vagina to the outside of the body.
So that's why I put the end, because visually in my head you have to grow it to get rid of it. Again, that's the debate you can have. So the uterus is responding to the estrogen progesterone made basically with a follicle, and the follicle is responding to the pituitary. Right? So you get this chain of command idea. Now let's go through those hormones one more time. So if you remember, we were right about here. We're at ovulation, right?
The mature follicle to rupture and release the egg, the process of ovulation. LH then triggers the remaining follicle cells to differentiate into the corpus luteum, which secretes estrogen and progesterone. The corpus luteum remains in the ovary, secreting estrogen and progesterone for the last 2 weeks of the cycle. At this point in the cycle, these hormones again inhibit the release of FSH and LH. A decline in FSH and LH restricts follicles from beginning to develop during the second half of the cycle.
Okay, listen to what he just said there, right? If we go back, at this point in the cycle, blah, 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 these hormones inhibit the release of FSH, right? So let's think about that. What kind of feedback would that be if I'm inhibiting something? Bingo, so over here we're going to add some more information in. So at ovulation, you are positive feedback. But once you ovulate, you are not positive. You are negative feedback. Once you've released the egg, you don't want any more egg. Why not? What's wrong with having a bunch of extra eggs?
You only have so many.
Right, do you want to have a litter? You probably don't, right? So once you release the egg, your body assumes you're pregnant until you menstruate, and then the body says, try it again. So while you've released the egg, the body says, I don't want any more eggs until this pregnancy is ended. And then I'll release another one. So as long as you're here, you're stopping that. You're stopping the new round. That's what they mean by inhibits FSH and LH. Make sense? So at ovulation, you're positive, but then you switch to negative immediately.
Does the entire hormone volume for this process come from a single follicle?
Sorry?
Does the entire volume of hormones for this process come from a single follicle?
More or less, yes. The other secondary follicles which are forming also add to it, but 99% of everything you see is the single follicle. It doesn't look to scale here, but actually corpus luteum takes up like most of your ovary at that time. So it's a huge beast, and then it gets really small again. So but it makes a lot of hormone, cranks out a lot of it. Yeah, so basically one follicle is running your uterus and your brain and lots of other things, right? So.
Follicles from beginning to develop during the second half of the cycle. LH, or a hormone produced by an implanted embryo, is required to maintain the life of the corpus luteum. At the end of the cycle, if an embryo is not implanted, the corpus luteum degenerates. When the corpus luteum degenerates, it no longer releases estrogen and progesterone.
Okay, so that's the idea that if you don't conceive, everything flushes out and then you go again. Okay, so now we're going to put the uterus on this right here. So we left off right about yay. Right?
Body has reached its peak. Afterward, the follicle cells remaining in the ovary develop into the corpus luteum, a structure that releases estrogen and progesterone. The hormones maintain the uterine lining at a peak thickness and preparedness for embryo implantation. At the end of the cycle, if the egg is not fertilized or has not implanted, the corpus luteum breaks down and stops releasing estrogen and progesterone. Without these hormones, the uterine lining also breaks down, initiating menses.
All right, so I'm going to now do it a little differently. We're going to go back through it one more time. There's one more piece of detail with that. This is the Australian version.
Gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus.
Step one.
Gonadotropin releasing hormone level slowly rises as the monthly cycle begins. It binds to receptors in the anterior pituitary and stimulates the release of the gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, called FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH.
So this is just like in the male, right? GnRH, the only thing different is over a month and not over a day. It's the same kind of logic. So click on GnRH.
The anterior pituitary gonadotropin, FSH, travels through the bloodstream to the ovaries and promotes follicular growth. Increased follicular growth promotes estrogen production. The release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary is inhibited as the level of estrogen in the blood begins to rise. At the same time, these gonadotropins continue to be produced and to accumulate in the anterior pituitary. Eventually, the concentration of estrogen is high, which triggers the release of the buildup gonadotropins. The result is an intense flow of luteinizing hormone, and to a lesser degree, follicle-stimulating hormone.
That's the positive feedback part.
The luteinizing hormone surge initiates ovulation, the release of the secondary oocyte, and triggers a decline in estrogen production by the follicle. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for transforming the ruptured follicle into a corpus luteum.
So I'm going to skip ahead just a tad here.
The corpus luteum secretes both estrogen and progesterone, increasing their blood levels. These increased ovarian hormones inhibit the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone.
And that's the negative feedback part. So when I get after ovulation, I'm going to turn off the one ordering new eggs. I'm going to turn off the brain.
Luteum also releases the hormone inhibin, which enhances this inhibitory effect.
Bingo! Where have you heard inhibin before? Last week. So same pattern. So males and females are not that different in terms of the idea. So your brain does not know how many eggs you have, so we're going to use inhibin. So after ovulation, what do you think inhibin does? Go up or go down? It's going to go up. Just like in the male, I don't want more eggs after I ovulate. So I'm going to raise inhibin, which is going to lower FSH and LH. I'm going to turn off my brain. And then when I menstruate, inhibin comes down, and then I turn on my brain again in this context. Okay. So again, after ovulation, luteal phase is a negative feedback event. As long as I'm doing this, I'm not going to do that. When this stops, I do that. So you're teeter-tottering back and forth. Make sense? So that's the inhibin part of this. Okay. So, I'll show you one more little thing here. Which is
The ovarian cycle is the monthly sequence of events that takes place in the ovaries. The three phases of the ovarian cycle are the pre-ovulatory phase,
follicular,
the ovulatory phase, and the post-ovulatory phase.
or luteal. So that's the three steps that we're talking about. So before you ovulate, like I did in the board. Okay, that's just what we're talking about here. If we go to the uterine cycle,
The uterus goes through a cyclical developmental pattern to be ready for implantation and support of an embryo. The uterine or menstrual cycle is under the control of ovarian hormones. The uterine cycle also has three phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase.
that's the fancy words for proliferative is when you're growing, so that's before you ovulate. Secretory means after, but I don't care about that in lecture. All right. So I flush, grow, make it bloody, flush, grow, make it bloody. That kind of logic. So you have three phases in your uterus controlled by three phases in your ovary that are controlled by your brain. Make sense? That's the magic of the menstrual cycle. All right. So I piece that all together, basically. So this would be a summary of
The
basically
28 days of the female reproductive cycle can be divided into 4 phases. Days 1 through 5 of the monthly cycle are the menstrual phase.
which you could put at the end if you felt like. I don't really mind that.
Low levels of progesterone and estrogen allow for the shedding of the stratum functionalis of the endometrium. These low levels allow the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which in turn stimulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Increasing levels of follicle-stimulating hormone stimulate follicular development.
Right, that's 1, 2, and 3 over there, basically. All right. So I don't have an egg, so I'm going to grow me an egg, is what your brain is thinking.
Days 5 through 13 of the cycle consist of the pre-ovulatory ovarian and proliferative uterine phases. The presence of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulates the development of ovarian follicles, which then increase their production of estrogen. The increased levels of estrogen stimulate the stratum bassalis of the uterine endometrium to proliferate and thicken. As the ovarian follicles mature and make more estrogen, the high levels of estrogen create a positive feedback loop to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. This stimulates secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, and further maturation of the follicles. On day 14, ovulation occurs as a result of a surge of luteinizing hormone signaling the mature ovarian follicle to rupture and release a secondary oocyte. During days 15 through 28, the post-ovulatory and secretory phases of the ovarian and uterine cycles, the ruptured follicle collapses and reforms to become the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes estrogen and larger amounts of progesterone, causing the endometrium of the uterus to further thicken. Glycogen is secreted from the endometrial glands to prepare for a possible embryo. Increased secretion of inhibin hormone signals the anterior pituitary to decrease secretion of FSH and LH. If the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum disintegrates and the cycle begins again.
Oh, very good. Makes sense? So again, brain talking to ovaries, talking to uterus through 5 hormones and 4 organs, right? How complex. So what you want to do at some point in your college career, if you can mentally walk me through that when we go over the exam, that's something I want you to be able to do, is that. You may want to take a picture of that with your phone. It's also in your book, it's online. So you may want to be able to look at that picture and explain it to me. Hint, hint. In a week. Hint, hint. At 6 p.m. Hint, hint. Come on.
Does the inhibin kick in just after you ovulate?
Basically, yes, and it climbs as the corpus luteum increases, the inhibin increases with it. So it maximizes basically about a week after ovulation and then decays the next week. So you get that. So basically it matches the green peak. So inhibin would start about here, or about there.
And so estrogen and progesterone inhibit FSH and LH.
Yes, as long as it's over here.
Okay.
Over here they increase it, over here they decrease it.
Inhibin is just aiding that?
Yes, one more signal to it.
So inhibin comes in the luteal phase,
yes,
and that's supposed to inhibit FSH and LH.
Yes.
But then step 1 in luteal phase was LH continues and makes.
Right. So LH doesn't go away entirely; it's just lower, but it doesn't increase like over here. So it goes down and just stays kind of a low level.
Okay.
All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice this skill. So find your packet of pain for a minute. We're going to. I'll come back to that. Find page 30. We're going to do a little case on female reproductive. Watch your eyes. We'll do this one together in the interest of time. Okay, so we have a female, has all these pains and aches, and they do a bunch of expensive stuff, and they look at her uterine stuff, and they find endometrial tissue on places other than her uterus. They found it on her ovaries. So, what do you think that's called when your endometrium is in the wrong place, basically? Endometriosis. Ah. So endometriosis, endometrium is the root word, that's the uterine lining. So So some part of your body other than your uterus is acting like a uterus. That's basically what it means. And that leads us to this word. Medical terminology people, what does ectopic mean? Outside, wrong place. Incorrect location. So where should endometrium be? Inside your uterus, but it's on her ovaries. That's outside of where it needs to be. That's an ectopic tissue. Where else have you heard this word ectopic? Pregnancy, that's somewhere outside of your uterus. Fallopian tube or whatever. So if we put this together, someplace other than her uterus has uterine tissue. Right? And what does uterine tissue do each month? Let's see. What's it do before you ovulate? It grows big. What's it do after you ovulate? It goes away. So her ovaries are expanding and trying to menstruate even though they can't come out. So if you get endometriosis, it could be on any part of your body that would grow and then try to slough off each month because it thinks it's a uterus and needs to follow this pattern. Right? Your eye can get endometriosis and your eye actually grows and tries to slough off in your socket. Not a good plan. Right? So your tissues are behaving like a uterus when they're not there. Creepy thought. So how to get there? How does endometrial tissue get outside of your uterus?
This is why you have a job?
That's why I have a job. Indeed, yes! You're learning. All right. One reason I have a job. Other than I'm unemployable any other way. All right. Let me show you this picture. There are two hypotheses. We don't know which one's true, but we're going to do one of them. Let's look at this picture again. So, uterus is here, endometrium's there. Okay, what would happen if a piece of your uterus broke off, and instead of going down, went up? Hey, look here. What do you see? Open spot. What's out here? Anything else? So one hypothesis is your endometrial tissue breaks off and goes backwards up your fallopian tube, and since there's no connection, floats around. And where would you end up if you float around?
Who knows?
On an ovary, on a colon, on a spleen, on your diaphragm, any place you want. Right? So one hypothesis is that the uterine lining breaks off and goes backwards into your body. The fancy word for that is retrograde. So we'll add that to the magic statement. Not that one. So one hypothesis is retrograde movement. No, you don't have to know that for a test. So it goes backwards, it goes out above the body. The other hypothesis is some kind of weird genetic disorder. All cells in your body are hearing the same hormones and somehow they build the receptors back like the uterus. So either way, you can end up with endometrium tissue somewhere else. So the big question for tonight is number 5. Looking at these hormones, I want to inhibit her gonadotropins. So let's find gonadotropins over here. What things are gonadotropins? Where is it? Which one? Number one is a releasing hormone, not a gonadotropin. These are gonadotropins. They trope your gonads. So if I inhibit those, would that help her with her symptoms?
Yes.
Vote for yes. I got a nod. I got another nod. Just nod your heads. Yes. Let's walk through it logically. If these never go up, that means your ovaries never grow eggs, which means you never make estrogen, which means you'll never grow any tissue, therefore there's nothing to slough off because you didn't grow it. So the logic is if I stop this side, you don't have that side, right? So that's the logic. If I inhibit the gonadotropins, it should stop the cycle. So we're going to put a yes there. Right? If I stop growing eggs, your uterus should stop too. Does that make sense? Yes?
So would that affect the GnRH? Like,
yes.
Is that how you would do that?
Right. So we're going to do that next. That's the next question. There's more than one way to do it.
Okay.
Do everyone see the logic here? If I stop this, I stop those? That's the logic. So the next question asks, how are we going to do that? How could you stop FSH and LH? All right. Let's figure out how we can do that. So how could I stop you from making FSH and LH? There's 3 ways.
Turning off GnRH.
I can lower GnRH as one possibility. So if my hypothalamus doesn't order anything, management doesn't have to do anything. What's another choice?
Pregnancy.
Well, let's assume you don't want to be pregnant. That would work. Look over on that board for a while.
Progesterone high?
What is it?
If you keep progesterone.
I could increase progesterone. Because remember, progesterone basically causes some negative feedback. What else could I do? Look over here. I could also increase inhibin. Those would be some ways I could turn off your brain as long as I don't have my hypothalamus on or I tell it I'm post-ovulatory. Which of those might be the best choice if your uterus getting big and small is kind of a problem? Maybe. Yeah, that one would, it could work. I'm thinking this one might be good. Right? Because if I turn on inhibin, that's going to turn off my brain automatically without having to do the uterine. Let's do oral contraceptives. So, we're going to learn contraceptives today. What's in those?
Hormones.
Good, good. What hormones? Magic hormones. What's in them?
Estrogen.
There's estrogen and or progestin. That's the logic. So you take a bunch of those. Look over here. When those are high, what does your brain think is going on? You are here, which means you are ovulated and or pregnant. Therefore, what you do when you're over here, you don't do over there. And so the answer is yes. So this would stop ovulation. You are pregnant on the pill. Therefore, your brain assumes you don't want another one.
So it just keeps you in the luteal phase?
Yeah, you're permanently luteal, basically. That sounds off, doesn't it? You're just luteal. Yes. But the logic is if you're over on that board, you're going to stop your brain from ordering new eggs. That's the logic of this exercise. Make sense? To show you I'm not making this up much, let me show you an animation of oral contraceptives. I actually have. I thought I had. Where'd it go? Go. There's no sound with this one, so I'd have to do it in like some British accent. So pretend I'm an Aussie or something here. Okay, so this is kind of reviewing the little graphs here. But if you read through this one, the magic line's right. The pill uses the body's negative feedback system. So what phase are we talking about for negative feedback? Luteal phase. So you're trying to trick the body to being luteal. And thereby, if you're luteal, you don't become follicular. Right? So what's in the pill? Estrogens and progesterones, depending on what pill you have. Blah, 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 blah. They travel up to your brain and suppress FSH from the pituitary. So your brain assumes you're pregnant, therefore I'm not going to order another egg. Right? I love this. The pituitary steps down. Remember that downregulate, tolerance stuff from 231 Mouse Party? That's what you're doing. Your pituitary assumes you got too much and turns off. Right? No follicles develop, no estrogen goes up, no thickening. And so if you look at the graph, these are staying flat because I'm not growing more eggs. Right? Right? You're going without the surge, no ovulation, no egg, no deal. And your cervical mucus stays plugged. Right? That's the logic of a birth control pill.
But you still menstruate.
You still do. You still have some blood, but it's not, usually, well, you don't have to. So what happens is you menstruated, you take your pill, there's a little bit of time for it to grow, but not a lot. That's why usually menstrual periods are less, because you didn't have 14 days to grow it, you had just a day to grow it. And then you secrete that. So it's supposed to reduce the amount you have. You always gain some blood flow. Although you don't have to take the sugar pills, and you wouldn't bleed ever. It's just.
What about like the Implanon kind of thing? A lot of times you don't menstruate at
Yes.
all, so how come the lining is promoted?
Because you do it before you have a chance to grow the lining.
Oh.
So you're basically forcing you to be pregnant without doing the pre-ovulatory phase. So you didn't grow it, you just keep what's already there. So it stays small. Yeah.
So if you're born with a certain number of eggs.
Yes.
And you're not ovulating because you're taking the pill.
Yes.
Do you have menopause later because you still have more eggs in there?
No, unfortunately, there's no relationship between egg number and menopause. When you have menopause, you have about 30,000 eggs left. You just don't bother to use them.
I thought I read something about there being a relationship with the number of follicles left.
You said you have more than enough follicles when you have menopause to keep going. In fact, you can prove that. That woman in England that got pregnant at 85 or whatever it was, yeah, that proves you still have eggs left. What happens in menopause is your brain orders eggs and your ovaries say no. Your ovaries go on strike and they refuse to make an egg even though the brain orders more eggs. So your brain wants eggs and your ovaries say forget it, even though they have some.
So does the brain then, it's pumping out FSH and LH?
Yes.
So your ovaries.
That's right. So you still have eggs left. Yeah. You don't run out. You still have hundreds of eggs, thousands of eggs left. Right. So having said that, this one, let's scroll ahead here. Let's go here. Find page 35, because PCC says you're supposed to understand contraceptives in a vague, general sort of way. All right, so we have various contraceptive methods, and we're supposed to figure out how they work. So let's try the first one. Abstinence. How does that work? If you don't have sex, you don't get pregnant. Hopefully everyone understood that concept, right? Right, so you don't have sex. Let's get down to number 2B. So spermicide. Up here we have some words. So spermatogenesis means what, medical terminology people?
Making sperm.
Making sperm. Oogenesis is making eggs. Ovulation is releasing the egg, right? Ejaculation we learned last week, that's releasing the sperm. Right? Sperm motility is a fancy doctor way to say they're swimmers. Fertilization is when sperm meets egg. Congratulations, you're pregnant. Implantations, maybe you find your uterus, and other means I don't know. So, spermicide. Which of those words would it affect?
Sperm. Motility.
Motility is probably the closest answer. Because you still make sperm, you still ejaculate sperm, you still make eggs, sperm just don't go anywhere because they're dead. Dead sperm don't swim. That's a rule. So spermicides are affecting the motility of the sperm to get to the egg. Dead men tell no tales. Condoms, diaphragms, barrier methods of your choice. What word would you say is probably the most accurate one for them?
Ejaculation?
I vote for ejaculation because it keeps the semen out. You could argue that. Possibly sperm motility because they can't get out and get somewhere. But again, you still make them, right? So it's affecting the ability for spermia to meet. So I would argue ejaculation and/or motility. Either one's fine, however you view that. So you still release an egg, you still make sperm, they just don't meet. Okay, from what I just taught you, oral contraceptives, which word did they affect?
Ovulation.
Ovulation is the best answer. You don't release a new egg because you never stop being luteal. So you never get to here. There's no egg, there's no baby, no way. Right? So that's going to keep you from ovulating under ideal conditions. Wow. So how about Depo and what that, the ring thing and all those? What are they doing? They're doing exactly the same as birth control. They affect ovulation. They're hormonally preventing a new egg from being released. So the only difference is kind of dosage and the mechanics. Yes?
So would it be oogenesis?
Well, you can argue that, but you already made them before birth. So you still have yours not releasing them. So that would be the argument I would make. But you could argue either way. That's fine.
So the copper IUD,
Yes?
that's spermicide, right?
Actually, that's implantation.
The way that it works, okay.
Yeah, the one that has the hormones in it would actually be ovulation and implantation.
But the one without the hormones is just, but isn't it because the sperm doesn't like the copper?
Partly that, but the main effect was the uterus rejects any implantation when there's something in there. So it does have a slightly spermicidal property, but the main one was actually this one, rather than any spermatic Let's keep going. Where are we? Where am I? Oh, pull and pray. Yes. Which word do you think applies to that one? In theory, ejaculation or other, you just aimed wrong, right? But that's the idea is you're trying to keep the sperm away from the egg the old-fashioned way, right? Not necessarily the best plan, right? Okay, try this one. Natural family planning, NFP.
Ovulation.
Right, so if you don't know what that is, you're trying to time intercourse to either become pregnant or not become pregnant by figuring out when this occurs. Because the only time you can conceive is when the door's open and the egg is there. So you're timing ovulation. That's the plan. So if there's no door, no egg, there's no baby, no how. So NFP is about figuring out when you ovulate. Right? So it's an ovulation system. Okay, IUD. So there's a hormonal one which works like a pill, and there's the old non-hormonal one, which I think I just mentioned. That deals with implantation primarily. Prevents an embryo from implanting a uterus. Your uterus is kind of cool. If something's already in your uterus, it won't allow something else to be there. So it rejects any implantation event. Assumes there's already a baby once.
But
Yes.
then you can have twins with different dads.
You can. The trick is you'd have to have sex the same day or within the day of the ovulation because they're usually a day apart. So by then, they both implant a base at the same time.
Yeah.
We can speak about the moral question involved in that one. But like rabbits or cats, they actually ovulate when they have sex. So hence you get the tomcat effect. But it has to be basically the same window of implantation. In humans, we don't really do that so much. So let's do vasectomies and triple ligations. You can still make them.
Sperm motility.
They still swim. Yeah, they just don't come out, right? Your sperm can't go up the highway, and your eggs can't go out, so you can also argue ovulation. So you make them, they just don't leave, because you cut the highways for them. Make sense? So that's the argument of different contraceptives. You're affecting different steps in this process. So let's flip the page.
So with
Yes.
ligations, sorry, one second.
Yes.
So if you're stopping the sperm, but then do all the fluids still come out?
Yes.
I'm picturing like a big backup of stuff.
They call
The
shooting
sperm
blanks.
is
You have
so
all the fluids, just no sperm.
tiny. Okay.
Right, because the fluids are downstream. So you're cutting the vasectomy between the epididymis and some of the vesicle line.
So the sperm are so tiny that it doesn't matter that all of those thousands, hundreds of millions of sperm that you're making are just going to hang out.
Right, they basically lived in the epididymis for 2 weeks, and then they die of old age. White blood cells come up and eat them, and
Okay,
they
so
recycle
they
there.
stay
So they basically die in school.
So then it's all gone forever.
Yeah, and then you just keep making more, and then they die, and you keep making more. Your body doesn't realize why they're dying.
When you're in school for so
And so
long.
when women ejaculate after vasectomy, it's just all the fluid, the lubrication.
Right, so you have to ejaculate, I forget how long it is, but you have to clear the pipe downstream, and then eventually you ejaculate a spermatozoa, which is no sperm. So it takes a while to clean the pipe out. So this should not be any of you, right? Let's pretend that STD is a problem for you, fools. So what contraceptive would you use?
Condoms.
Condom barriers would be a good plan, so no body fluids. I would say abstinence, but that's why you have an STD, because you don't believe in that. So anyway, that's my conservative side coming out. All right, so number 2 is where we're gonna go for today. So we're looking at words. Remember agonist and antagonist, right? What do agonists do?
Increase.
Increase, same as, or bind to same receptor. Antagonists do what? Block, blocker, stop, inhibit, right? So, looking at the contraceptives, do they do the same thing as hormones, or do they block hormones?
Depends.
So what's in your oral contraceptives again?
Estrogen.
Isn't it these?
Yes.
Isn't the goal of these to do that?
Yeah.
So they're doing exactly the same thing, right? So they're agonists. They do exactly the same thing as your hormones do. They're mimicking your hormones. They don't block your brain, they negative feedback your brain. That's a verb. Right? So your contraceptive pills just carry the same hormones your body has. So you're doing them in that phase.
Hormones that don't make you.
That's right. So you're being more pregnant than you planned. That's going to turn off your brain. Right? So where do they act? Do they go on your gonads, your pituitary, or the hypothalamus? How do you orally contracept yourself?
Table bone.
Pituitary.
So which things do we have to turn off to not make eggs? So pituitary would be the most direct answer. I'm going to turn these off. My goal is to turn off FSH and LH so I don't grow eggs, so I don't grow estrogen and so forth. You can also argue, well, I could also turn off GnRH, and that would also work. So you could say hypothalamus, you could say anterior pituitary.
How are you
You're turning off management.
How are you turning off hypothalamus though?
Because it reads, like in the male, the hypothalamus also reads the pituitary's levels as well.
Okay.
So if this is getting blocked, those are getting blocked. So you're not turning off your gonads. The gonads just don't get the message from boss, and therefore they shut down. Make sense? So you're tricking your brain. So let's do this one. All right. So suppose you're doing natural family planning. You want to know when you ovulate. Tell me how you'd know that.
Mucus.
Cervical fluid gets thin. Remember, your cervix has to open. What else? Basal temperature goes up a degree. There's some other kind of changes. Basically, you're trying to figure out if there's mucus from your cervix, if your temperature's climbing. Those are the ones you plot on the graph. There's an app for that, believe it or not. Your phone can actually help you plan that. Here's the question though. B, if you're checking your hormones, which you can buy at the pharmacy, there's kits for hormonal ovulation tests. What would they see?
High everything.
High what?
High estrogen.
High estrogen and high LH and FSH. Those are the ones that increase when you ovulate or just before you ovulate. So you can pee on the stick and see if your estrogen is going up or your LH and FSH are going up. Or you can measure your fluids, measure temperature. There's other ways to do it. Yes?
And if it was just estrogen going up, it would be in the luteal.
Well, if it's just this one, the highest it gets is here. But if all you knew was estrogen was around, you wouldn't know which one. But you have to actually see it spike, and then you have to usually correlate it with one of these more accurate. Right? So ideally, you'd look at two hormones. But estrogen, if it's really, really high, would also prove that. Make sense? So hormonally, you'd see the ones there. So why do we only care about ovulation time?
Because that's the only time you can get pregnant.
Only time you get pregnant, there has to be an egg and an open cervix. So this is as a parent, right? When my daughters get home today, which will be when they're 45 and I'm dead, right? I'm going to tell them you get pregnant anytime, all the time. But look at a boy, you're pregnant. Boom, stay away from him. But in real life, you have 1 day, roughly, to conceive. That's when your cervix has to open, the egg has to be there. So in real life, this is the only time you can't have babies when it's closed or babies before there's an egg. Right? The problem is it's hard to time that, and so that's where the problem exists.
Because sperm live for
when you're ovulating, sperm can live up to 2 days. If you're not ovulating, they live about a day. But since you can't time that well, people get too close to the window, so to speak. Right? Because your immune system hates sperm like crazy and kills them all off. Right? So let's say you want to be a male and you have a hormonal contraceptive. What would you block to turn off your sperm but still be manly and sexy? You agree with that? Yes. FSH would be the best plan. Because what would happen if you turned off LH as a man?
No
No
And what does
sexy.
testosterone do for men?
Making
Makes you manly and sexy. So I want to turn off the sperm, the fish, and not the testosterone. So I want to turn off FSH and not LH particularly.
So, is that a thing? Like, why isn't it more like
It's in the UK. Yeah, they have it. It doesn't market well. That's one reason it's not here. It was an injection that made people with daily injection. It's kind of a hard sell. So, and then they also found out that it just women are more likely to take a pill than men are to take a shot. I'm just telling you. All right.
I can understand that.
I just tell you what it is.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so hormones are highest during ovulation, but then
Yes.
symptoms associated with menstruation, so to speak, are highest during menstruation.
Yes.
So is there some correlation between low levels of hormones and like emotional
Okay, so
instability?
Okay. If you look at the literature, PMS is one of these things that no one can define or prove because, unfortunately, PMS symptoms vary amongst everybody. So in all the literature, people actually say there is no such thing because they can't find a pattern. Don't hit me, right? So what happens is for some women, they get a lot of symptoms. Some women get no symptoms. Some women have symptoms before they menstruate, while they menstruate, after they menstruate. So there's no definitive pattern of how it appears. So scientists kind of call it like this is made-up syndrome. But there's a different behavior at menstruation than there is at ovulation. So at ovulation, then the behaviors tend to be different in terms of your personality changes than at menstruation. They actually tend to be kind of opposite. So worthless trivia, when women ovulate, they're more likely to change their sexual arousal. They get more aroused more often. They find a different partner they find attractive. They're more likely to commit adultery when they ovulate. They also change how much makeup they wear and the size of the shoes they wear, believe it or not. That's style of shoes. Right? But when you menstruate, that all goes away and you go to some other pattern. Makes sense. And we're right. Men get more possessive when you're ovulating. They call you more often. Right? Yeah. But there is a difference between when one are all last versus
The ones are not like right? You want to attract the ladies.
Right.
Right after you go off of hormonal pills, you're like way more likely to get pregnant.
I didn't know that was true.
It is.
What was it?
You're more likely to
I
get
do not know. I
pregnant
cannot give you an answer.
right after you quit birth control.
So that one's outside my
Related
expertise.
to the hormones.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Dear
blame some.
gentlemen, science has been.
Right. So, blame some hormones. So to finish this up before I tell you what's on your test, let's go backwards a couple pages in your packet of things. So scroll back up. Find page 31. This is not a political statement. I'm not interested in having some kind of diatribe about transgender and intersexual rights and cultural norms and hegemony of white males and blah, blah, blah. Right? I just think this is kind of cool science. Because I'm a conservative, I don't buy half this anyway. But let's do different ways you can categorize things as male or female, because that's something that's coming up in the news, right? So, if you were doing sex chromosomes as the definitive marker of male versus female in humans, for biology 112, what's a male? XY. So you would say, if you have XY chromosomes, you are male. What's female? Very good. So you can define people by the sex chromosomes they have. It's called the genetic sex test. You could say, no, Mr. Christie, I believe hormones are the answer. So what hormone would you define as male?
Testosterone.
Testosterone. Very good. We do, but not nearly as much as we do. So the primary, predominant. Women's is 10% of men's, roughly. So we got a lot. So what hormones would you say are predominantly female?
Estrogen.
Those two. So you can say you're female because you create these progesterone, these hormones. All right? You can say, no, it's all about the gonads and gametes. So remind me from biology 112 what a male gonad would be. The testes, where you make the gamete. What gamete do you make as a male? Sperm. So if you have testes and you make guys with tails, you're a male. So if we're doing female, you'd say it is the ovaries, and you make oocyte or eggs. Right? In fact, in biology, that's how we define it. Motile gametes make you male, stationary gametes make you female. You can say internal genitals. So what male genitals are inside from your chart last week? True, but we already got that. Let's pick a different one. Prostate could be one.
Vas deferens.
The vas deferens, you could argue. You could say the epididymis. Everything that has an I from last week, you could say is a male. Let's do female. Give me some internal female parts.
Fallopian tubes.
Fallopian tubes.
Ovaries. Cervix.
Ovaries we got. Let's do a uterus. That's a pretty cool one, right? Cervix. Okay, you can say the same thing about what you see on the outside. So give me an external male thing. Wow, never heard that one before. All right. So you can say the penis, you can say scrotum, right? How about female? All the vulva, yeah, vulva word, there we go. All right, all the E words. Now, you can say no, it's about the secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are things you associate with male and female, but are not genitals. So males would be what? Yeah, this stuff I don't shave, right? Face, lots of hair, deeper voice, shoulders, body fat, you know, blah, blah, blah. Lots of things. And for females, what would you say are secondary sex characteristics?
Breasts.
Breast, hips, body fat, lack of hair. There's a whole battery of them you could list, right? Things you associate with male and female looking. And then the last one, which is off screen, we could talk about over beer, is behavior, right? How do men behave and girls, right? But depending on how you define male and female will determined by which category you use, right? So this leads to the question of like, which one do you pick? Because I can get a different answer depending on what I choose. So if you were to ask chromosomal sex of your children, what determines that? If I were to check their chromosomes, I would be looking at their what?
DNA.
Their DNA, which is the XX or XY. So I would look at their chromosomes and say, well, if you're this, you're a girl. If you're that, you're a boy. Okay. If I wanted to see how their bodies looked, what would I look at?
Genitals.
Like the genitalia, right? So, but what determines your genitals? Where do they come from? Hormones. So I'd be looking at things like their hormone levels. Testosterone makes you grow a penis. So then the harder one, if you want to do their gender, what would you look at? That's the question of the week, right? So, but again, I could get a different answer. So we're going to do that experiment on rats. So this is not on your test, so don't put too much mental energy into this, okay? They did studies on rats, trying to figure out how you can tell a boy rat from a girl rat. What makes you a male, what makes you a female. So what they did was they took rat embryos, fetuses, that they knew were going to be female or knew they were going to be male, and they started removing parts and seeing what happened. So in case you're looking at this wondering, like, who are these weird names? Those weird names are names given to the tubing inside your body before you're either male or female. So if you look back here from last week, remember this? All those H words we had? So you start out as something, and then you pick kind of which side of the line you want to be on, and I convert you from one to the other, right? Turns out there's actually a biological basis for that, and it's right here. So this, they call them bipotential gonads. So when you're an embryo, you have a gonad. And then you have two tubes. You have things called Wolffians and Mullerian ducts. So you have a red and a blue tube. Each tube corresponds with different sex. So if you want to be a male, you turn these into testes, destroy the red and keep the blue. The blue one becomes your seminal vesicle, vas deferens, and epididymis. So I throw away the girl tube and keep the boy tube. If you want to be a girl, reverse. You keep the ovaries, you throw away the boy tube and keep the red tube. There's your fallopian tubes, oviduct, uterus, cervix, vagina. So depending on which tube you pick, determines which tubing you end up with, right? So the rule is that the Wolffian duct is the blue one. That's the boy one. So we remember that all men are dogs. So the wolf tube is how you get a boy, right? You never have to know that. But if you go back to this, so where it says Wolffian, that means boy. Mullerian means girl. So if you have a normal female, she turns on her girl plumbing and turns off her boy plumbing, right? I take out your ovaries, and what happens?
Still developed.
You're still a girl, 100% of the time. So no matter if you have ovaries or not, you'll always make girl plumbing. Tell me why you want to do that, mammals ye. What are girls for? Making babies. So if you're a mammal, it makes perfect sense that you always want to have females form. Right? So this is called the default. If in doubt, you're a girl, because girls have babies, even in rats. And now we're going to see what males are like. So here's the test. Male, I took out his testes. Male makes male plumbing. I took out your testes, and what do you see?
Female.
You're a female. Because you turned off your boy, turned on your girl. So what does it take to become a male according to this? What is it? Testes. So we have one half of the puzzle. So to be a male, to be a normal male, in this case, You need testes to be a male. If I don't have testes, I am a girl. Does that make sense, the logic here?
Can you just say that again?
You need testes to be a male. Otherwise, you're a female. But the plot thickens. Here's some data. I'm not going to tell you how to interpret it. You're going to interpret it. So here's the studies they did. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to read that and try to figure out what that proved on that data analysis, and we'll talk about it.
Proved nothing.
It proved a lot, actually. Try that one.
You need testosterone to equal the male. Yeah, you have to have testosterone. There's no testosterone. How do you not? You don't know twos. What does that mean?
You're neither male nor female. You have neither one. Both disintegrate.
So you're just empty inside.
Yes.
Are you still like alive?
Yes, it really does. I can show you one that actually doesn't. So let's go through the data. So we have normal male, should turn on boy tubing, no girl tubing. I take out your testes, according to what you told me earlier, I shouldn't be a male, right? So boy turns off, girl turns on. Now, these two are showing something. So here on the last one, I still have your testes. If I block testosterone, what do you see?
No.
You're neither. And if I add testosterone but don't have testes, I am both. So to be a normal male, I need two things, which are testes and testosterone. So this data proved if you want to be a male, you have to have testes, otherwise this person would have been a male. And you have to have testosterone. I'm sorry, this person would have been a male. And this one. So I need both, because if I take out one of them, I don't get the right answer. Right? So to be a male, you have to be testes and testosterone. So that leads to all sorts of problems, like this. So there's a gene that you learned in 112 called SRY. Its job is to help you become a male. So I'm going to show you a little video of what that does. Real quickly here, which I put right here. Right there.
Confession. Your life actually began as a female. Well, phenotypically or physically speaking, that is, though some prefer to call this stage gender neutral. As you might know, when two people mate, they each combine half of their genetic information together, 23 chromosomes each. One pair of these chromosomes helps to determine your sex. If you're female, you contain two X chromosomes, one from your mother and one from your father, while males have one X and one Y chromosome. At the moment of conception, you were of course male or female based on your genes, but the Y chromosome doesn't kick in right away. In fact, the first 5 to 6 weeks of embryonic development are attributed to the X chromosome alone, and females grow from embryo to fully developed through the influence of only the X chromosome. So what does the Y chromosome do? Once activated, one of the genes on the Y chromosome, known as the SRY gene, has two functions: to inhibit certain features of the X chromosome, and to impose through dominance the physiological traits that a male must have. The ovaries descend and become the testes, and the labia fuses to create the scrotum. If you're a male, take a look. Though it's more pronounced in some men than others, you'll likely notice a line or ridge of tissue on the scrotum, which is called the scrotal raphe. The skin of the scrotum and penis are zipped up like a zipper as the layers of cells develop in the embryo. And the male variant of the clitoris? Yep, that's the penis. If the Y chromosome does not become activated for some reason, then the female phenotype or physical appearance will persist in a male. While we're at it, this is also part of the reason males have nipples. The nipples form before the activation of the Y chromosome and SRY gene, and thus remain through development and life. But you don't develop breasts. Sorry. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
I don't know, it's off now. I like this. So that's telling you about that SRY concept. That's the thing that makes you male. So we'll go back to our last little bit here. Well, this is a class. So pretend you were double X chromosome. So genetically, what would that be if you're double X? Female. But I gave you that SRY gene, the one that they talked about. What would you be if I gave you the SRY, but you're double X?
Female.
You're going to be a male, because that's going to tell you to do this. You'll be 100% male, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But you'll be genetically a girl.
So the one gene has the testes and the.
Yes. So on a blood test, you'd show up as a girl, but if I looked at you, you'd be a boy.
So would you still produce sperm?
Yep, because you'd make testes, you'd make testosterone, you would be, everything about you is a male except your genetics.
And you'd only produce X sperm?
Yes, you make perfectly fine sperm. Although they can only be X, which means you can only have daughters.
Right.
Okay. So let's do this one. Your double X, I'm sorry, no, your XY, if I take off the SRY gene,
You're a girl.
you're a girl, because default says you're not a male unless you get SRY. So even though you're XY chromosome, you're a girl 100% of the time. Right? You're all girl all the way. So then look at this one. You're XX, and I give you just testosterone.
Masculine, female.
Let's find out. So XX without the SRY would mean I'm doing this box right here. I'm just giving you testosterone, which means you are both. You'd be intersexual. You'd have both male and female parts because your body didn't know it should be both male or female. It just decided to be half of one and the other. All right? Which leads you to this idea right here. Here's Terry. Read this little blurb. Let's see if we got Terry. So Terry has XY chromosomes, right? And she has testes, but she didn't have girl parts. She didn't make boy parts. So how do you end up with XY testes, but no, you're not all the way a boy?
No testosterone.
She didn't make any testosterone. Good answer. She forgot this part. So she ended up a girl looking, but without the parts to be a boy. So when you look in the mirror, to freak you out tonight, your genetics may be totally different than how you look because of this process of how you turn boys and girls into each other. Just to give you a hang up next time. Right? So she is a girl looking who's actually genetically a boy. And she didn't get either piece because she didn't get fully testosterone. Cool, eh? Right. Yes?
When a woman, or an XY woman,
Yes.
tries to have a baby,
Yes.
what happens if the male, how does that work?
So,
Donation of the chromosome.
right, so it'd be like mating two males. So basically, a quarter of the time you'd have daughters XXs. Half the time you'd have males. And a quarter of the time would be double Y, which is not viable. So you'd really only have, you'd have more boys than you would girls statistically, and a quarter of the pregnancies would not validate. If you're the XX male, then all you would have is daughters, because you could never transmit a Y. Statistically, right? But this is just a little thing about how you make males and females. So having said that, let's talk about your exam, which is next week, which is why you're still here looking at me. So I'm not going to ask you anything about being boy or girl. That's just something to talk about. Once I figure out the lights. I have a degree I did. All right. Let's talk about your test. Let me know when you're ready. Ready? Okay, question 1 is on the flow of urine. So if I were a kidney stone, where would I be if I started here and went there? So real basic question, right? So how do you be? All right, let's see. 1, 2, 3. I have 3 questions at this point. They'll be different. On GFR. Remember that from way back when? Glomerular filtration rate. So what makes it go up? What makes it go down? How do you compensate short term? So be able to tell me about GFR. I have a whole page of questions on the nephron. That picture you took, that some of you didn't do so hot on that quiz, review that again. So what things go in or out? What's reabsorbed? What's secreted? What's in your DCT? What's in your PCT? Blah, blah, blah. So be able to quote to me everything goes in and out of a nephron and where it goes in and out. If it's active or passive. Okay? So you will feel pain on that page. Right. But know the nephron. I have 3 questions on urinalysis. So what should be in urine, what should not be in urine? So for example, Jonathan's peeing blood. Now what does that mean? Is that good or bad? Yes, I'm killing him. Yes. So what does it mean if you have sugar in your pee? What does it mean if you have protein? That kind of stuff. I have 4 questions on ADH and aldosterone and the nephron. So if you were dehydrated, what would ADH do? What would your urine concentration do? What would the channel do? Those graphs I put over there, right, that's what you're supposed to know. So if you drink too much water, not enough water. I have an ECF and ICF question. So if Jonathan gives you a hypertonic IV, what water goes from where to where kind of question. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's call it 10. 10 acid-base questions. Well, some of them are multiple parts, right? So I mean, it's actually more like 4 actual things, but the so on some of them I've given you a narrative, like Jonathan's throwing up. Is that metabolic or respiratory? Blah, blah, blah. On some of them I've just given you numbers. Remember, you have to memorize the numbers. I just give you some values. You got to figure it out. On some of them I've given you some other information. So there's multiple ways I'm going to ask you these questions. So
Left and right shift.
I'm going to ask you left and right shift. I'm going to ask you how you compensate, which organ system's compensating. Is this going up or is this going down? All that kind of stuff. So every possible way I could ask you these questions, I will do so. Right? They do tell me that's the most important thing you're going to learn. So memorize those numbers, be able to do, I don't care if you do tic-tac-toe or equation, I don't care how you do it, as long as you get an answer that's metabolic alkalosis with a respiratory compensation, blah, blah, blah. So you got a whole page of those. All right, I have 3 questions on the reproductive boxes that you did last week. So what organs are male, what ones are female, are they inside or outside, what did they do? Jonathan chops off his penis in protest. Boom, what's that gonna do? Yeah, laugh, my clown, laugh, right? Is it inside or outside? The pathway in order. If I were a sperm, where am I gonna be? If I were an egg, where am I gonna be? Right. I have 3 questions on the, well, kind of 2.5 questions, on the glands, the male seminal fluid glands. So what does each gland make? What's it for? Could you interpret that? All right, and I have a couple questions on the male reproductive hormones. So like we did on the quiz today. Jonathan's FSH is down. What does that prove? What's inhibin gonna do? Who talks to whom? All right, then I have a whole page on the menstrual cycle. So thou shalt be able to quote back to me before and after ovulation, what hormone's going up, what's going down. If I gave you a graph, could you label it? If I told you to make a graph, could you make it? Those kind of things. So be able to walk me through the menstrual cycle. So I'm an evil man. And I have 2 questions on contraceptives. So explain to me how they work in relation to what you've learned. And that's what I have coming for you 1 week from today. The rest of your time you can use for any